2:15 in the afternoon on the first Monday of October, 3 floors below the reading rooms of the Ashworth Library in Chicago, Cleo Winters sat bent over a sheet of 1761 paper. Her brush was sable, the width of a single eyelash, and the folio above her work table was insured for $120,000. Naomi came down the service stairs without knocking and reached across the table for the open page before Cleo could raise a hand.
You patch old paper in a basement, and I'm taking your name to Paris.
In the same second, the page tore along its gutter. A thread of pale gold caught the light where it had snagged on the stone of Naomi's ring, glowing under the black light strip still switched on from the morning's inspection. Cleo said nothing about the thread, filed the color of it in the back of her mind, and reached instead for the humidity gauge clipped to the lamp. On the far side of the glass partition, a man in a gray overcoat had stopped on the third step from the landing close enough to have heard everything. After a long moment, he turned around and went back the way he had come. If you are watching this in Atlanta, it is likely early evening where you are, and if you are watching in Manila, it is already tomorrow. Leave your city and your local time in the comments below, because the people who write these stories like knowing how far a single Monday afternoon in Chicago can travel before someone answers it. Subscribe before the next part, because what happens to a torn page rarely stays a private matter for long, and this one did not. Here is the question worth sitting with before we go back down those stairs. How much of what we call talent is really just paperwork? Nobody bothered to check. Now, back to the basement, 2:15 in the afternoon, the page still torn. Cleo set her brush down on the felt pad tip first, the way she always did. She looked at the tear for exactly as long as it took to memorize its shape, 4 inches along the gutter, fold ragged rather than clean, consistent with a page pulled rather than cut. She did not raise her voice, and she did not reach for her sister's wrist, though for one full second her hand moved as if it might. The library's evening supervisor, a heavy-set man named Ferris, who had been on shift since noon, came around the corner at the sound of the tear. He stopped in the doorway with a clipboard still open to the visitor log, a page that would later matter more than he understood in that moment. He looked at the folio, then at Naomi's ring, then at Cleo's face, and he wrote nothing down, because nobody had told him yet what he was looking at. Naomi straightened her jacket, said she had only come to bring her sister lunch, and left the way she had come, taking the service stairs 2 at a time. The paper bag she claimed to have brought was never found on the table, a detail Cleo would not think to mention to anyone for another 3 weeks. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has decided independently and without discussion to pretend they did not just watch something happen. Cleo photographed the tear from 3 angles with the department's archival camera before she touched anything else. That was the first rule Corinne Boyd had ever taught her: document before you feel anything. A rule Cleo had followed so many times it no longer felt like a choice. Only after the 3rd photograph did her hands begin to shake, and she let them alone for the 11 seconds it took Ferris to leave the room. Down the hall, a graduate researcher named Diane in the reading room for an unrelated dissertation would later remember hearing a single sharp sound and assuming it was a chair scraping tile, nothing more. No one else in the building that afternoon would ever know exactly what had happened 3 floors below them, and Cleo, for reasons that took her weeks to fully understand, preferred it that way. When the shaking stopped, Cleo did not call her sister, and she did not call their mother, who would only ask why Cleo insisted on making everything so complicated. She opened the department's incident log, a plain gray binder kept for water damage and light exposure, and wrote the date, the time, and a 2-line factual description with no names attached to blame. A log with an accusation in it gets challenged. Corinne had told her once, but a log with only facts in it gets believed. She photographed the gold thread where it lay caught on the table edge before it could fall, sealed it in a coin envelope from her repair kit, and wrote a case number on the flap in pencil. Then she photographed her own hands, palms up, no visible injury, a habit she had picked up years earlier after a different client had once claimed she damaged a manuscript herself. It was the first time in 11 years she had thought to protect herself before she thought to explain herself to anyone. A folding table in the corner of a church basement on the south side, stacked with paperback spines, was where Cleo Winters first learned that torn things could be made whole again. A hand-lettered sign taped to the table's edge read, "Mending 10 cents a book," the ink already fading by the second summer it hung there. She was 9, and the woman running the table was her grandmother, who had raised both girls for 6 years while their mother worked overnight shifts at a distribution warehouse. Their mother came home too tired most mornings to notice which daughter had done the dishes and which one had simply said she had a pattern that repeated itself often enough that both girls eventually stopped expecting anything different. Naomi, 4 years older, was never at the mending table. She was upstairs in the choir room being told correctly that she had a beautiful voice. She was also being told incorrectly that beautiful things did not need to also be careful, a lesson she carried into every year that followed. Their grandmother kept a tin of beeswax and a spool of linen thread on that table for 30 years. She also kept a second, smaller tin, unlabeled, that she never opened in front of either girl. Cleo did not learn until she was an adult that it held her grandmother's own mother's sewing needles kept sharp and useless for 40 years out of something closer to habit than sentiment. When she died, she left the tin to Cleo without a note because she had never believed in explaining a gift. Their father had left when Cleo was 5, and their grandmother never spoke badly of him. She only pointed out once that a man who could not stay could hardly be blamed for raising daughters who learned to expect nothing and prepare for everything anyway. By the time Cleo was 23, she had an associate degree in library science, a part-time bindery apprenticeship, and a habit of checking every hinge on every book twice. Naomi, by 27, had 3 unfinished degrees and a talent for describing herself as an art historian at parties. She also had a genuine gift for making people believe her before they checked a gift their mother had always mistaken for confidence. Their mother, when asked, still said Naomi was the smart one, and Cleo had stopped correcting her sometime around the funeral, when correcting people had started to feel like a second job. Rare book conservation is not romantic work. Whatever the documentaries suggest, it is mostly chemistry and patience, and Cleo had built her small reputation on both. She kept a laminated card taped inside her toolbox listing every solvent she was permitted to use on parchment versus paper. Corinne had made her copy the card out by hand before she was allowed to touch anything older than a century. She could identify a 19th century iron gall ink by its faint corrosion halo before she ever tested it with a swab. She kept a reference library of her own retouching samples, cross-sections mounted on glass slides, because insurers occasionally asked a conservator to prove which repairs were hers. For every major restoration, she used a single private marker, an ultraviolet reactive thread no thicker than a hair, sewn once into the binding thread itself. The dye came from a small supplier in Ohio that sold to exactly 4 conservators in the country, a detail she had never once mentioned to a client or an employer. It was invisible in daylight and gold under blacklight, a trick Corinne Boyd had taught her the year a client tried to claim Corinne's repair as an in-house staff job. Cleo had used the thread on the 1761 folio on day 2 of the contract and logged the placement in her private notebook in blue ink under the day's date. She never mentioned it to anyone at the library because a marker only works if nobody knows to look for it. By the time Naomi tore the gutterfold, that thread had already been sewn through the very page in question. A detail that existed nowhere but in Cleo's notebook and in the page itself. She had met Nathan Co 11 months earlier on a Tuesday she remembered mostly because the library's freight elevator had broken that morning. She had carried a crate of restoration tools up 4 flights rather than wait for the repair crew setting it down twice to rest her arms. He was standing outside the conservation room with a courier badge clipped to his coat delivering a folio from his family's collection for condition assessment. Instead of making conversation, he watched her unpack the crate for a full 3 minutes without saying a word, which most people found either rude or unsettling. Cleo found it, for reasons she did not examine too closely, restful. When she finally asked if he needed something, he said only that he had never seen anyone check the humidity gauge before setting down a box. Most owners of old paper, he added, did not think to ask whether a room was safe before asking whether a person in it was any good. He was not, it turned out, a courier at all, but the founder of a small materials forensics lab that authenticated ink, pigment, and paper for museums and auction houses. Hyatt delivered the folio himself because he did not trust couriers with anything older than himself, a line Cleo found excessive and told him so. He laughed for the first time in the conversation, a short, surprised sound, as if laughing were a muscle he did not use on schedule. They did not become anything in the 11 months that followed, not officially. He brought his family's damaged pieces to her table more often than the state of his collection strictly required. A folio here, a water-stained ledger there. She began keeping a second cup on the shelf without deciding to and refilling the electric kettle before he had even texted that he was coming. The second time he visited 3 weeks after the first, he brought a water-stained parish register from a church his family had once funded. He set it on her table without a word and sat down to watch her work exactly as he had the first time. He did this 11 more times over the following months, never announcing why until Cleo stopped asking and simply started clearing a space on the table before he arrived. He kept, she noticed eventually, a small paper cup of black coffee balanced on the one corner of the table, she never used for anything wet, as if he had studied the room before he ever sat in it. What neither of them said out loud that Tuesday or any Tuesday after was that Nathan Seo's small forensics lab held a standing contract with the very insurance carrier that underwrote the Ashworth Library's rare manuscript collection. That carrier, Whitmarsh Cooperative Insurance, had underwritten the 1761 folio the same spring it entered the library's collection. He had not yet told her that, and she had not yet asked. Naomi found out about the contract, the way she found out about most things that mattered to her secondhand, and at a disadvantage. The fundraiser itself had been for the library's endowment, an event Naomi had not been invited to, a fact that stung more if she was honest with herself than anything said about Cleo at it. Their mother mentioned over a phone call that Cleo's name had come up at a fundraiser as the conservator behind the Ashworth showpiece restoration. Their mother said it the way she said most things about Cleo, as a fact reported rather than a fact celebrated, but Naomi heard something else in it, an opening. She asked carefully what exactly the restoration involved. Their mother, flattered to be asked anything at all about either daughter's work, repeated back nearly everything Cleo had told her over the past month: the folio's age, its insured value, even the name of the library's finance director. She had applied 6 weeks earlier, and without telling anyone, to a fully funded conservation fellowship at the École du Louvre in Paris. Her portfolio was built almost entirely from photographs of restoration work she had not done, most of it lifted from conference programs, and one badly cropped image of Cleo's own hands over a text block. The fellowship committee had asked in a polite email. Naomi had not answered for a single verifiable current project to round out the application. It needed to be something ongoing, something with an institution willing to confirm it on paper. The email had come from a committee coordinator named Marguerite, and it gave Naomi exactly 19 days to supply the missing verification before her file was closed for the cycle. The 1761 folio, worth $120,000 and currently sitting under her own sister's hands, was the only verifiable current project Naomi was ever going to get. She realized this within an hour of the phone call, standing in her own kitchen with the fellowship deadline circled twice on a calendar behind her. She did not ask Cleo for access because she already knew what the answer would be, and she had never been someone who enjoyed being told no twice. The wedding client had never asked for repayment, only an apology Naomi never gave, and Cleo had carried that story quietly for 2 years without once repeating it to their mother. This was not, in fact, the first time Naomi had borrowed someone else's paperwork to get somewhere faster. It was, though, the first time the paperwork belonged to family, and the first time the number attached to it ran past 6 figures. 2 years earlier, she had padded a freelance photography invoice to a wedding client by $400. It was a detail their mother still did not know when Cleo had only learned by accident from the client herself at a different wedding entirely. The following Thursday, Naomi drove to their mother's house and let herself into the small home office where old paperwork was kept out of habit rather than need. In a folder from a bindery job Cleo had done for the family Bible 11 years earlier, she found 3 sample signatures on old invoices. She practiced Cleo's signature for 2 days, tracing it first, then copying it, freehand filling half a legal pad with attempts before one satisfied her. She practiced it on the backs of old grocery receipts and torn envelopes, anything that would not be missed, and burned the legal pad itself in the kitchen sink before their mother came home from her shift. It was not out of any special skill, but because the two of them had spent a childhood being told they wrote like a fact their grandmother once used to catch them trading homework. On Monday morning, Naomi called the Ashworth Library's finance office and identified herself using Cleo's contractor number, photographed off an old invoice on their mother's desk. She requested a routine update to the direct deposit account on file, citing a bank merger as the reason, a detail she had rehearsed in the car beforehand. The clerk who took the call, a part-time student named Priya, processed 40 such requests a week and had no reason to doubt a contractor calling her own vendor line. Priya mailed the standard change of payee confirmation form to the address on file, which was still their mother's house since Cleo had moved 8 months earlier and never updated it with finance. Naomi signed the form with 2 days of practice behind her and mailed it back the same afternoon from a post office 3 blocks from her apartment. By the following Friday, the entire $120,000 restoration grant was sitting in an account opened 3 weeks earlier under the name N. Winters Consulting. Priya's supervisor would later tell the auditors that the department processed roughly 300 such vendor updates a year. A callback verification step existed on paper, but was rarely enforced when the caller already had the correct contractor number in hand. The finance office's own procedures manual, reviewed later as part of the audit, listed the callback step as mandatory for any change exceeding $10,000 a threshold. This request had cleared by more than 11 times over. She also asked Ferris in a friendly voice, and with a story about a family scheduling conflict, to temporarily suspend Cleo's after-hours key card access. She called it a paperwork overlap, and Ferris, who liked Naomi and had never once spoken to Cleo outside of a nod, agreed without checking with anyone above him. Cleo found out she no longer had after-hours access on a Tuesday evening when her keycard failed at the service door for the second time. Ferris, apologetic, told her about the scheduling overlap. Naomi had mentioned a sentence that told Cleo everything and nothing at once. She did not call her sister, and she did not raise her voice at Ferris, who was only doing what he had been told. Instead, she asked in the same even tone she used for humidity readings, whether the finance office kept a written log of card access changes. She asked, too, whether she could see it, a request Priya honored 2 days later out of simple procedural courtesy. The log showed the request had come by phone from a caller using Cleo's own contractor number on a day. Cleo had been sitting in the conservation room the entire afternoon. 3 witnesses and a signed visitor log could prove exactly where she had been, a fact Cleo noted in the margin of her own copy. Cleo asked for a printed copy, thanked Priya, and did not explain why she wanted it. Priya, for her part, did not ask, though she mentioned afterward to a coworker that something about the request had made her go back and double-check 2 other vendor files from the same month just in case. That same week, she opened a folder on her personal laptop, labeled it with a case number rather than a name. She began saving in order every document that did not match what she remembered doing herself, starting with the access log. Next came a photograph of the coin envelope holding the gold thread, then a screenshot of her own contractor account just showing a payment status that now read paid rather than pending. The funds had been marked paid 3 full weeks before they were actually due, a detail that made no sense unless someone had already redirected them. This was the moment, the low, simmering unease she had carried since 2:15 on that Monday afternoon finally organized itself into something with edges. It became a shape she could work with instead of a feeling she had to carry, and she found the difference steadying. She had spent her whole life being the daughter who did not make noise, and sitting alone with the folder open at 11 at night, she found she did not intend to start now. She intended to be quiet and correct instead, which was a different thing entirely and closer to the only kind of power she had ever actually trusted. She began keeping a small paper calendar beside the laptop as well, marking each new document with a single checkmark. A system with no purpose except to make the work feel finite when nothing else about it did. The envelope arrived at their mother's house on a Wednesday, a plain window envelope from the Ashworth Library's finance office. It confirmed a completed direct deposit change addressed not to Cleo Winters, but to N. Winters' care of the same street address Cleo had grown up on and left 8 months earlier. Their mother, who still opened every piece of mail that came to her house, regardless of the name on it, called Cleo to ask why the library was writing to Naomi. Cleo asked her mother to keep the envelope exactly where it was unopened further and to say nothing to Naomi about the call. Her mother agreed with more ease than Cleo expected, which was its own small, quiet piece of evidence about what her mother had already begun to suspect on her own. Cleo photographed the envelope over video call front and back before her mother had even finished agreeing and added it to the folder item 4. Their mother asked before hanging up whether she should be worried, a question Cleo did not answer directly, only telling her to keep locking the door at night, the way she always did, nothing more than that. 3 weeks into the standoff, neither sister had named out loud. Naomi filed a formal written complaint with the Ashworth Library's Conservation Oversight Board. The board was a 5-member volunteer panel that met quarterly and rarely had anything more serious to discuss than storage humidity budgets. The complaint alleged that Cleo Winters had mishandled the folio during a private moment in the conservation room, causing the 4-inch tear along the gutter fold. It also suggested the insurer should be notified of possible conservator negligence before any claim was paid. Naomi signed the complaint using her own name, this time calmly, because a complaint carries more institutional weight coming from a named private citizen than an anonymous tip ever could. She had timed the filing, too, for a Friday afternoon when she knew from Cleo's own offhand mentions that the finance office ran on a skeleton staff. Any response would have to wait until Monday, buying her. She calculated a clean weekend of certainty before anyone could push back. The board obligated by its own bylaws to suspend a conservator's active access pending review of any negligence claim voted by email within 48 hours. Only one member, a retired paper conservator named Walter, who had worked with Cleo twice before, asked in his reply whether anyone had actually spoken to Cleo before the vote. The board chair answered by noting that the bylaws did not require it at this stage. The vote placed Cleo's contract on administrative hold, a decision that meant she could no longer legally touch the folio she had spent 3 weeks restoring. The letter informing her of the hold arrived on library letterhead, polite and procedural, the kind of document that destroys a career by following every rule correctly. Cleo read it, standing at her own kitchen counter, still in her coat, and set it down carefully on the table rather than crumpling it, because even in that moment, some part of her still wanted the paper itself undamaged. For the first time since the tear, Cleo cried not at the loss of the contract which she expected she could eventually appeal. She cried instead at the specific, deliberate cruelty of being accused in writing of damaging the one thing she had protected most carefully in 11 years of work. The hold also meant her name came off the department's public roster for the length of the review, a small administrative deletion that nonetheless cost her 2 other freelance inquiries within the same week. It was Nathan CO calling about an unrelated shipment 2 days later, who mentioned in passing that his lab had just been asked to perform an emergency forensic assessment. The Ashworth's insurance carrier had requested the assessment on a damaged folio before any claim could be processed, standard procedure whenever a loss exceeded a certain threshold. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most work, briefly and without names, already moving on to ask whether she had eaten anything since morning, a question that had become a habit of his over the past 11 months. He did not yet know the folio was hers, and she did not yet tell him because for one more day she wanted to be someone he had simply met for coffee. What she did not know and would not learn for another 11 days was that the assessment protocol required a full material history of every repair made to the page. That history would trace thread by thread exactly whose hands had done the work. Nathan learned the folio belonged to Cleo's contract on his second day into the assessment when he pulled the library's project file. Her name sat on the original restoration agreement dated the same week he had first watched her unpack a crate without being asked. He did not call her that night, though he wanted to. 11 months of bringing his family's damaged pieces to her table had taught him something about the kind of person who does not want to be rescued, mid-sentence only heard. Instead, he read the board's negligence complaint 3 times, noting that it had been filed by a private citizen named Naomi Winters, a name he recognized immediately. His lab's assessment protocol required a full review of the payment and access history attached to any contract under review, and that history had a name on it now. He said nothing to Cleo about any of it for 4 more days, not out of caution, but because he understood something watching from a professional distance for the first time in their acquaintance. What she needed from him was not comfort, but competence, delivered quietly and on its own schedule. When she finally told him herself over the phone in the flat, careful voice she used when she did not trust herself to sound anything else, he listened for 11 minutes without interrupting once. Only at the end did he ask a single question: whether she still had the coin envelope with the thread. What Cleo did not know was that Nathan's Family Foundation had co-funded the Ashworth Library's rare manuscript conservation grant program for the past 6 years. The foundation's name appeared on a small brass plaque in the library's donor hall, a plaque Cleo had walked past a dozen times without ever once connecting it to the man who brought her damaged pieces to restore. That relationship had been established by his mother before he was old enough to have an opinion about it. It came with a single specific contractually documented right: the right to request an independent audit of any grant disbursement above $50,000 if a funding irregularity was suspected. He had never once exercised that right in 6 years, partly because he found the position distasteful. He had also avoided it because his mother had always treated the foundation's oversight power as a tool for punishing people who embarrassed the family name. The foundation's bylaws, which he read in full for the first time that week despite having signed them years earlier without much thought, made clear the audit right existed to protect the grant program itself. It did not exist. The language made equally clear to protect any single funder's reputation. He exercised it now in writing through the foundation's counsel rather than through any personal channel. He requested a full audit of the $120,000 restoration grant disbursement connected to the Folio project, citing the mismatched payee name his lab's assessment had already flagged. The request cited 3 specific documents by exhibit number: the payee change form, the access log, and the assessment's own preliminary fiber report. It was a level of detail his counsel insisted on precisely, so the request could not later be read as a personal favor. The audit request went to the library's finance director, not to Cleo, not to Naomi, and not through any conversation Nathan had with either sister. I understood correctly that the request needed to come from an institution with a documented right to ask, not from a man who happened to be seeing one of the 2 people involved. It would take the auditors the finance director estimated in her acknowledgement email somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks to produce a full report. That timeline felt unbearably slow to Cleo and entirely ordinary to everyone who had ever actually audited anything. The finance director's acknowledgement email also confirmed as a matter of routine disclosure that all 3 prior audits the foundation had ever requested across other institutions had resulted in findings substantial enough to warrant referral. That fact Cleo did not learn until much later. She copied the finance director's email in full into her own case folder that same evening, dated it, and added a single line beneath it, 2 to 4 weeks underlined twice. Nathan had walked away from his family's shipping business 8 years earlier, a decision his mother Helen Seo had never fully forgiven. She rarely let a visit pass without mentioning it, usually by comparing him gently and devastatingly to his younger brother. That brother had taken the position Nathan refused and now ran the Pacific Freight Division from an office 2 floors above their father's old one. As the eldest son, Nathan had been raised to understand that the business was not a career choice, but an inheritance with obligations attached. Walking away from it, however, quietly counted in his mother's accounting as walking away from the family itself. Helen kept a small shrine to Nathan's grandfather in the sitting room of her house, a black and white photograph in a bowl she refilled with rice on the anniversary of his death every year without fail. She had once told Nathan in Korean, believing he had not caught every word after so many years away from fluent conversation, that his grandfather would not have recognized what his eldest grandson had chosen to become. He had caught every word. He had never once repeated the sentence back to her in Korean or in English, and she had never once asked whether he understood it. Silence both of them had maintained for 11 years without ever discussing why. His younger brother had never once gloated about the position, and the 2 of them still spoke every Sunday. That made the whole arrangement harder for Nathan to resent cleanly, since the person who had taken what he refused had never asked for it either. Founding the forensics lab had been in part his answer to a question his mother never asked directly. The question was whether a life built on precision and evidence could count as honorable if it was not also built on the family's name. He had not brought Cleo to meet his mother in 11 months, not because he was ashamed of her. He already knew with a certainty that made him tired exactly what his mother would say about a conservator who worked out of a library basement for a contractor's hourly rate. On the Sunday before the audit request went out, Nathan drove to the small apartment Cleo had moved into 8 months earlier. He found her at her kitchen table, surrounded by printed pages arranged not by date, but by some private logic only she seemed to follow. Corners squared, a red pen resting exactly parallel to the table's edge. He didn't ask what the system meant, and he did not offer to reorganize it. He simply pulled out the second chair, the one she had bought, without quite admitting why, and began reading the pages in the order she had already chosen for them. For 3 hours. Neither of them spoke more than a handful of words, mostly requests to pass a page or a highlighter. Cleo found somewhere in the second hour that this was the first time since the tear that her hands had stopped wanting to shake. He noticed without saying so that she had underlined every date twice and every dollar figure once. He noticed too that she had left one page entirely blank except for a single word written in the corner, thread circled twice. He did not ask what it meant, filing the question away the same careful way she filed everything else. It told him more about how her mind organized fear than any conversation could have, and he adjusted his own note-taking to match her system rather than impose his. When he finally left near midnight, he took nothing with him but a single photocopy of the finance office's access log. She let him take it without asking why, because by then she had learned that his questions, when they came, always came with a reason attached. It was Cleo, not Nathan, who found the detail that finally connected the tear to the theft 3 days before the audit report was due. She was rereading her own restoration notebook for the 11th time, looking for anything she might have missed. On the page logging her placement of the thread, she had noted the exact date and time of the fourth and final pass, 2:19 in the afternoon, 11 days before the tear. That timestamp existed nowhere except in her own handwriting and in the microscopic weave of the thread itself. She sat with the notebook open for a long time before calling anyone, reading the entry 3 separate times as if it might change on a fourth reading. Important things sometimes seem to when you have waited too long to notice them. If the thread could be dated and matched to that notebook entry, it would prove not only that Cleo had done the restoration work, but that she had done it weeks before Naomi's fellowship application. It would prove Naomi's submitted photographs showed work she could not have performed since the thread had not existed until Cleo herself sewed it in. Cleo called Nathan's lab directly, not Nathan, and asked to speak to whichever technician handled fiber dating. She had decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she would rather hand over evidence herself than wait to be handed a result. The technician who took her call, a young man named Owen, who had never once spoken to a conservator, directly asked her to overnight the coin envelope rather than mail it. It was a small kindness, and she noted it and thanked him for it twice. The finance audit, when it landed in everyone's inbox 9 days later, confirmed in dry institutional language what Cleo's folder had already shown in photographs and dates. The entire $120,000 grant had been redirected to an account opened under the name N. Winters Consulting, using a forged payee change form. The report closed the question of where the money had gone, but it opened a new one. A single line in the audit's final paragraph noted that the Fellowship Committee at the École du Louvre had that same week requested formal verification of the very project the auditors had just flagged as fraudulent. The Conservation Oversight Board called an emergency joint session 6 weeks after the tear in the same third-floor conference room where Naomi had once delivered a lunch nobody asked for. The same pitcher of water still sat on the sideboard, the same clock still ran 4 minutes fast, and the same 5 folding chairs still lined the wall for anyone the board decided to call in. This time Cleo sat at the table rather than being discussed from outside it, her reinstated contract paperwork in a folder in front of her. Beside her sat Nathan, present not as her partner but as the foundation representative whose audit request had triggered the entire review. A distinction the board's chair repeated twice for the record. Naomi arrived 12 minutes late in the same confident posture she had walked into the basement with 6 weeks earlier. She had chosen for the meeting the same navy blazer she wore to client presentations, a small deliberate choice meant to remind the room that she too could belong in a place with a table this long. She took the seat across the table without once looking at her sister, the way people who are certain of their own version of events rarely need to check anyone else's face. She had, Cleo would learn only afterward, spent the 6 weeks since the finance audit convinced that the payee mismatch could still be explained as a clerical error. It was a story she had already rehearsed for their mother and intended to rehearse again here in front of 5 strangers with a folder. She had practiced the word clerical in the mirror that morning, though she would never admit as much to anyone, choosing it deliberately, because it sounded small and forgivable in a way the truth did not. Before the board chair had finished reading the agenda aloud, Naomi leaned toward Cleo and said something quietly enough that only the two of them and Nathan could hear. It was something about baskets and eggs and the folly of putting a family's only real opportunity into the hands of a sister who had never once wanted something bigger than a basement. She said it with the specific, practiced calm of someone who believed the meeting would end the way every disagreement between them had ended since childhood. She had used a version of the same tone at their grandmother's funeral and at their mother's 60th birthday, and at every family gathering in between, where a quiet correction had seemed to her easier than an honest one. Cleo did not respond and did not look away from the folder in front of her. Under the table, out of sight of everyone but Nathan, her hand rested flat against the folder's cover, still the way it had not been still in 6 weeks. For anyone watching only her face, it would have been impossible to tell that anything had been said at all. It was in fact the last unkind thing Naomi Winters would ever say to her sister with any confidence that she would get away with it. The board chair, a retired archivist named Dolores, had chaired the panel for 9 years without once raising her voice. She opened the session by reading the agenda in full, unhurried, the way she read every agenda regardless of what waited beneath it. Nathan opened a pale gray folder an inch thick, its edges squared, and set it on the table so that the tab faced Naomi rather than the board. It was a small, deliberate courtesy that gave her the first and only chance to read the label before anyone else in the room did. The label read, in plain black type material and financial findings folio acquisition, number 447. Beneath it, smaller, sat the name of his lab and the case number the insurance carrier had assigned 6 weeks earlier. A single line beneath it noted the report had been prepared for the board and the general counsel jointly, not for any individual party in the room. He did not open it immediately. He let it sit closed on the table for a moment. It sat there long enough for Naomi to notice that her own name did not appear anywhere on its cover. Only a case number, the kind of detail that meant an institution had decided this mattered. When he did open it, the first page inside was a photograph high resolution of a single gold thread magnified 60 times under ultraviolet light. Its weave pattern was as distinct, the caption explained, as a signature, because no two conservators tied a fiber tracer knot the same way twice. A second, smaller photograph beneath it showed the same thread against a ruler for scale, the entire fiber, shorter than the width of a fingernail, magnified until its twist looked less like thread than rope. A brief technical note beneath the image explained the dye's chemical composition in a single sentence, enough for the board to understand it could not have been purchased or replicated without specialized access. Beneath the photograph sat a second document, a notarized comparison of that weave pattern against 4 other restoration jobs on record under Cleo Winters' name. It showed a full match on every measurable point, down to the tension of the final stitch. A third document, added at Cleo's own request 2 days earlier, listed the 4 other institutions holding restoration work carrying the same thread signature, each willing if asked to confirm the dates on record. Beneath that sat the finance audit, the access log, and a copy of the change of payee form. The audit itself ran to 11 pages, most of it routine reconciliation language, but the final 2 pages traced the diverted funds through 3 separate transfers before they settled in an account Naomi had not yet emptied. The forged signature on that form had been circled in red by a handwriting examiner the Foundation's counsel had retained independently of anyone in the room. The board chair read the findings aloud in the flat procedural voice of someone trained to keep her tone level in exactly this kind of room. She paused twice while reading, once to confirm a date against the calendar printed on the last page of the report, and once briefly to look directly at Naomi before continuing without comment. She started with the material evidence, the thread's weave pattern, and its documented placement date. That date was 2:19 in the afternoon, 11 days before the tear, a timestamp that made it physically impossible for the work to have been done by anyone applying for a fellowship with photographs dated 3 weeks later still. The finance director seated at the far end of the table confirmed aloud that the library's own project intake records independently corroborated the same date. It was a detail the auditors had cross-checked against 3 separate systems before including it in the report. She moved next to the financial evidence, the $120,000 grant disbursement redirected on a forged payee change form. The receiving account had been opened 3 weeks before the form was even filed, a detail the auditors noted as evidence of premeditation rather than a spontaneous error. She read the account's opening date aloud a second time slowly so that the number would sit in the room for a moment before anyone moved past it. Last, she read the access log, the recorded phone request that had suspended Cleo's keycard using a contractor number Naomi had photographed off an old invoice. It was a detail Cleo herself had supplied from the folder she had built alone at 11 at night for 6 straight weeks. It was only at this point, watching the board's faces shift from procedural attention to something closer to disbelief, that the whole story's quiet question finally found its answer. Why had Naomi been so certain from the very first day that none of this would ever catch up to her? Dolores, reading the final line of the report aloud, paused before the last word, the way she had paused only once before, in 9 years of chairing the panel, a pause. Everyone in the room understood without needing it explained. She had believed and had told a friend as much in a text message the auditors had subpoenaed, along with the bank records, that the only proof of who had actually restored the folio lived in Cleo's memory. It lived nowhere else. It was a private, unwitnessed skill that could never be checked against anything, and a sister who avoided confrontation would rather absorb a loss quietly than fight to prove it in a room full of strangers. She had never known about the thread because the thread was never meant to be known about. In 6 weeks of careful, procedural, entirely unglamorous work, a fiber the width of a single hair had done what no argument between 2 sisters ever could. It had simply refused to lie. Naomi's own lawyer, retained only after the audit findings arrived, sat present in the room for exactly this reason. He made a single note on his legal pad, dated it, and did not look up again for the rest of the meeting. The board chair closed the folder and thanked Nathan for the Foundation's cooperation. She turned to Naomi to ask for the record whether she had anything to say in response to the findings as read. 6 weeks earlier in a basement, 3 floors below this very room. Naomi Winters had told her sister that she patched old paper in a basement. She had told her in the same breath that she was taking her sister's name all the way to Paris. The seat Cleo occupied now at the head of the long table, rather than at its edge, had come to her by exactly the same route her grandmother's mending table always had. It came through work. Nobody had watched closely enough to steal until someone finally did, and it had not been enough. Naomi said nothing at all, which the board chair noted for the record before moving to a vote. Within the hour, the panel had unanimously reinstated Cleo's contract in full, with back pay for the 6 weeks of the administrative hold, and had referred the financial findings to the library's general counsel for further action. Walter, the retired conservator who had asked the one question anyone had asked on Naomi's behalf, voted with the rest of the panel. He added, unprompted, that he intended to recommend Cleo for the department's advisory seat once the review formally closed. Dolores thanked him for the recommendation and noted it for the minutes, a small procedural gesture that would 8 months later turn out to matter more than anyone in the room that day could have predicted. General Counsel's letter delivered the following week informed Naomi that the library was pursuing full repayment of the $120,000 through civil claim. The letter was signed by the library's general counsel personally rather than by a paralegal. A detail Cleo noticed only because Nathan pointed it out, explaining that institutions reserved a personal signature for matters they considered too serious to delegate. Separately, because forged. Financial instruments. Crossing state banking lines fall outside any single institution's authority to punish on its own. The matter had been referred to the Illinois Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit for review. The letter noted plainly that the process would likely take several months before any charges were filed, if any were filed at all. It also noted that Naomi retained the right to counsel and the right to contest the civil claim in court rights, the letter listed in full. An institution that skipped that paragraph invited exactly the kind of challenge it could not afford to lose on a technicality. The École du Louvre Fellowship Committee, notified separately by the audit's findings, at the library's request, rescinded Naomi's provisional admission within the week, citing falsified project verification. The decision was delivered by email, and unlike everything else that had happened, required no hearing at all. Marguerite, the same coordinator who had given Naomi 19 days to produce verification, signed the rescission herself in 4 brief paragraphs that offered no explanation beyond the phrase, falsified project verification and no opportunity to appeal. None of it happened in the room that day, and none of it happened quickly, but all of it happened in the ordinary, procedural, unglamorous way that real consequences almost always do. Nathan, driving Cleo home that evening, said only that he had watched enough of these processes from the outside to know one thing. Slow and certain, beat fast and fragile every time a sentence Cleo would repeat to herself more than once in the months that followed. The Fellowship Committee's rescission letter closed the last open question the audit had raised 9 days earlier. The question had been whether Naomi's application would survive contact with the truth, and the answer, delivered in 4 brief paragraphs of official language, was that it had not. Cleo read the forwarded copy once standing in her own kitchen. She read it a second time an hour later, not because anything in it had changed, but because some part of her still expected it to. Then she set it down and went back to the folio waiting on her work table because a torn gutter fold, whatever else it had caused, still needed mending. The Illinois Attorney General's office opened a formal file on the financial crimes referral 4 months later. By the following spring, Naomi had agreed to a repayment plan covering the full $120,000, rather than risk a criminal forgery charge going to trial. Her lawyer described the outcome without irony as the best resolution available to her. She moved out of Chicago that same spring to a smaller city 2 states away. Their mother, for the first time in either daughter's memory, did not describe the move as Naomi finally chasing something bigger. Cleo's reinstated contract closed out that winter with the folio fully restored. Its insured value was confirmed unchanged at $120,000, the tear along the gutter fold repaired so precisely that only a conservator looking for it would ever find the seam. The Ashworth Library's board, in the same quarterly meeting that closed, Naomi's case, voted to fund a new position, senior conservator of rare manuscripts. It was a permanent role rather than a contract, and the board offered it to Cleo without requiring her to apply for it at all. She accepted on the condition that the position include a standing budget for exactly the kind of preventive documentation that had saved her. That meant a private notebook system, a proper case log, and though she did not say this part aloud in the meeting, a fiber marking practice she now taught to every junior conservator who came through the department. Nathan asked her to marry him that same winter on an ordinary Thursday, rather than any occasion either of them would have planned for in the conservation room itself, after hours with the humidity gauge still running in the background. He did not kneel, and he did not bring a folder. He simply set a small ring box on the felt pad where she usually rested her tools, and asked if she would let him keep bringing damaged things to her table for the rest of his life. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which she would later admit was unlike her, since she generally preferred to hear a proposal through to its last clause before agreeing to anything. Corinne Boyd, retired 11 years by then, came to the small reception the library held to announce the appointment. She told anyone who would listen that she had known the day she taught a 9-year-old girl to check a hinge twice, that the girl would end up running a department someday. Cleo did not correct her, though she noted privately that it had taken considerably longer and considerably more paperwork than either of them had expected. Corinne, hearing about the engagement for the first time that same afternoon, said only that she approved of any man who understood the difference between a proposal and an interruption. She asked with real interest whether Cleo intended to keep her own name professionally, a question Cleo had already answered for herself months earlier. The department's new fiber marking protocol was adopted library-wide within the year, and 2 other Chicago institutions asked to license the method for their own conservation programs and inquiry. Cleo forwarded to legal without comment. On a Sunday in early spring in the kitchen of the apartment she had moved into the year, everything happened. Cleo stood at the counter with a colander of rice under running water. She rinsed it the way Helen Co. had shown her the previous month, 3 times until the water ran clear rather than cloudy. Nathan sat at the small table behind her going through invoices from his lab with the particular quiet concentration she had once found restful across a different table in a different, harder season. On the counter beside the stove sat a small white envelope, plain and unmarked, the kind Helen used for cash gifts on holidays. It had been left there that morning after a visit neither sister had expected to go as well as it had. Cleo set the rice to steam, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and stood for a moment at the window. She watched the last of the afternoon light move across a building she still sometimes could not believe was 2 blocks from her own new apartment, rather than 3 floors below someone else's library. Nothing about the moment was remarkable, which was increasingly the entire point. Their mother called that same afternoon, as she did most Sundays now, and asked without much preamble whether Cleo still had the tin of beeswax their grandmother had left her. It was a question she had never once asked in the 11 years before the tear. Cleo said she did, and that it still worked, and her mother said only that she was glad of that, and neither of them tried to make the moment mean more than it did. Helen Co. had not in the end apologized for anything she had said in Korean over the years, believing her son could not fully follow it. She had started without announcement removing her shoes at Cleo's door, before entering a small formality she had never once extended to any of Nathan's previous guests. On her last visit she had begun pouring Cleo's tea with both hands before her own, a habit reserved for elders and for people she had quietly decided were worth the trouble. It was not forgiveness exactly, and it was not yet family, but it was the kind of specific, deliberate courtesy Helen only ever offered to people worth getting used to. She had also on that same visit asked Cleo the proper way to store a length of antique ribbon she had inherited. It was a small question, one that cost her nothing to ask, and it told Cleo everything she needed to know about where things stood between them now. Somewhere between the mending table in a church basement and a senior conservator's office with her name on the door, Cleo Winters had learned the thing her sister never did. The quietest work in any room is usually the only work built to last. Their mother framed a photograph from the small engagement dinner and hung it in the same hallway where she had once hung a school photo of Naomi's choir solo. Cleo noticed the placement, but never mentioned it, the way she had learned to notice most things without needing to say them aloud. So here's the question to leave in the comments before you go, the same one from the top of this story now that you know how it ends. How much of what we call talent is really just paperwork? Nobody bothered to check, and how much of it is simply someone deciding alone at 11 at night to keep the receipts? If this story stayed with you, tell us your city and your local time below, and we will see you in the next one.